You know, it's happened to everybody who's tried to live. You know, you go through your life for a long time, you think that no one has ever suffered the way I've suffered. You know, my God, my God. And then you realize, you read something, you hear something, and you realize that your suffering does not isolate you. That your suffering is your bridge. Mm-hmm. That many people have suffered before you. Many people are suffering around you, and always will. And all you can do is bring, hopefully, a little light into that suffering. Enough light so the person who is suffering can begin to comprehend his suffering and begin to live with it and begin to change it, to change his situation. Mm-hmm. We don't change anything. All we can do is invest people with the morale to change it for themselves.
This week, I've been writing and thinking a lot about suffering, mostly in relation to the James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni interview, which happened way back in 1971. And I think whilst rewatching it, I realized there's so many home truths to what they said in that interview, and how much of what they said back then still relates to what's happening in the world today. And I essentially wanted to explore our relationship with suffering, how we understand suffering. And this video is not at all to try and glamorize suffering, because I feel as though that acts as a hindrance and doesn't really allow people to try and advocate for themselves in a place in which we think suffering is deserving, or suffering because we have gone through so much suffering that we are more deserving than other people. And it makes weird relations between suffering and what we're owed and deserved in the world, essentially. But I do think, as James Baldwin said, that our suffering can be our bridge, which is probably be the title of this video, which is Our Suffering is Our Bridge. But if you're new here, hi, I'm Sherwin, and this is Sherwin Unfiltered, where I explore media, fashion, politics, and everything in between. I really wanted to just start by defining suffering, and the common definition of what I found suffering to be was: suffering is the state of undergoing physical or mental pain, distress, or hardship, encompassing both acute agony and chronic misery. It represents a negative affective experience, often linked to threats against a person's well-being, creating profound personal or emotional turmoil. I really want to focus on the last bit, in which it says it creates profound personal or emotional turmoil. One of the great questions of the world is suffering, and why do some people suffer a lot and why do some other people not suffer nearly as much? And we can just say that the world is unfair, which that is true, the world is unfair, but we can also say suffering is enacted by the systems in the world, such as capitalism and other types of systems such as misogyny and sexism and racism, for instance, and a lot of these isms that the world has built its crutches on, in the instance that exist in a lot of our societies, essentially. But I really wanted to in looking into suffering, I really started to look into Buddhism and Buddhist teachings of suffering, and something I explored in a previous video in a lot more depth, in which cannot live in constant joy and we shouldn't aspire to, in which I really just explored the bouts of joy and why it shouldn't be constant. And I kind of looked a lot into similar like Buddhist teachings in relation to suffering as well. The first I really want to discuss in these teachings is dukkha. So the basis of Buddhism, when they think of suffering, is that suffering is inevitable, and dukkha really plays into this really well, essentially by saying that life is inherently unsatisfactory. You will never feel completely satisfied by life, and you shouldn't really try to, is what the concept of dukkha is really saying. And that bleeds into the second concept, which is anicca, in which everything changes. And Buddhists see like life as something that is constantly changed, nothing is really fixed, and we go through a roller coaster of emotions essentially throughout our lives. And for that average person, all of us will essentially experience suffering on some level. And for the average person, that's mostly or through the death of a loved one, or you lose something, or something like major will happen to you, but not something in a way that devastates your life. But for a lot of people who don't live in the West, or are the global minority in the West but majority elsewhere, we go through suffering on a stage that is of exploitation and through systems created by the West, or through imperialism, in which people go to suffering through poverty, or through sexism, for instance, or through like lack of infrastructure like clean water, or lack of access to education, or just lack of opportunities because of where you live, essentially. And that kind of suffering is man-made. And I really want to talk about this idea of Anicca because Buddhists argue that suffering comes from clinging to things that are already changing or transfixed. Like I said before, I kind of really explored this better in a different video, which I think I'll just put the description in the bio for this. But the idea with this video isn't really about glorifying suffering. I never really want to do that. And I do get quite angry. Sorry, I do get quite angry when people try and glorify suffering or make suffering this religious thing in which you are more deserving because you've gone through more suffering. But I don't think if suffering can be avoided and it's man-made and created through these systems that it can there should be change happening. And I kind of want to explore suffering as an instrument of change rather than something that is this unavoidable thing that cannot be changed, but rather as something that we use to make change because all of us will have suffered in this way that we complain about. And I think what James Baldwin was trying to say again, in which I want to link it, is that we see our suffering as an individual thing, and it is. No one will ever truly suffer exactly the way we suffered, but so many things that we share in our suffering, like, oh, people suffer through poverty or essentially like that. But so many of us have gone through levels of adverse poverty in our lives. Like, I can foresay that I've gone through levels of extreme poverty in my life in when I lived in Nigeria and when I lived in the UK and when I was homeless as a teenager and when I've gone through so many stuff that I felt like obviously a result of man-made creations in which suffering could have been avoided but really wasn't. And I think at times it feels so isolating and alone that only you are going through this type of suffering. But then, as James Baldwin says, you read something and you realize your suffering is not necessarily the most unique thing ever. Other people have gone through suffering, and in understanding that, you create a bridge in which, if we are all going through the same thing, we can try and enact change, essentially. In what James Baldwin is saying, I don't think if he meant to, didn't really mean to. You really start to explore this concept of the individualization of suffering. And it's not because your individual suffering is not important. In fact, it is the most important to you because it creates this sense of enlightenment. You've had to go through that level of suffering to fully be conscious in an instance of the systems around me don't make sense. The system around me oppress me and make me feel less than. And in understanding that and having that consciousness, because that individual consciousness happens so differently for each person, like each person, the light bulb moment for them might be different, which is why your individual suffering is unique to you and important to you. But the individualization of that, in which we're all suffering from the same issue, is what brings us together and makes collective movements happen. And if we think about a lot of collective movements that have happened in history, or like revolutions in which people have overthrown governments or people have made change, or people, okay, for instance, let's look at the civil rights movement or even the apartheid movement in South Africa. People know they've been oppressed by the same system. They may be oppressed in different ways, but it is by the same system. Or sometimes they're even oppressed in the same way. Like, if you look at civil rights movements, they're oppressed by race, for instance. Like Jim Crow South, like race stops you from being able to do your civil liberties, like vote or like freedom of speech, or in acts like, or like workplace discrimination. Because of the basis of race, you're kind of stopped from being able to live like a human being. And the way in which you're like what's the word, discriminated against by the system will be completely different, but the basis of it being race. So for instance, the way a black woman is discriminated is different from a black man, but they share the same basis of which is race, and that allows for movements to go forward. Same thing in South Africa with apartheid, in the way they're discriminated against, where you've got colored people of different multi-ethnicities. Like, South Africa is a rainbow nation, but you're discriminated against by the same system, in which apartheid is only beneficial to the white minority, might I say, the white minority in South Africa. And you suddenly realize we're both going through similar levels of adversity by the same system. We should work together to try and overcome this. And this is one of the reflections I really had when watching the Winnie Mandela documentary. This will probably be a separate video. But in that instance, our shared suffering, the way I've suffered, is similar to the way you're suffering from the same oppressor. So that becomes our bridge and becomes a bridge for many movements. And I think that's something a lot of us are forgetting in recent times, in which we're having this re-envision of this us versus them mentality, essentially. And what is this us versus them mentality I'm talking about? I'm really linking this into evolutionary psychology, in which when we started out as human beings, we had this me versus them idea in which we were fighting for resources, but then realized we shared something like skin color, gender, and that became this us versus them thing in which we fought battles with nations through basically nationalism, in which they didn't come from my country and they don't look like me, so I'm going to fight them in that instance. I think we're having this re-envision of this us versus them mentality when it comes into politics as well. Like a lot of, I want to really comment on politics in the West because this is what I've observed in this instance. Is like a lot of the observations I've made is, oh, but they're black, they don't really look like me, so I don't really need to care about their rights, but you're both facing the same issue, for instance, which is poverty. Like I, as a black woman who lives in the UK, and a working class white woman, or working class white man, both face the same issue of poverty, or what, housing discrimination, or in different ways. For instance, like you can't afford to get on the housing market. I can't afford to either, but I also can't afford to, and also people are being racist towards me because I look this way, and that might be in a covert way, for instance. But essentially, we're being oppressed by the same system, and not being able to get over our differences and having this us versus them mentality means that the system basically thrives on the fact that, oh, you look so different, don't you think? And this is why, like, when people are so shocked when parties like Reform or like basically extremist parties gain a huge amount of following, they find a way to deflect from the real issue in which you think you're making change by attacking a oppressed group. So the government or systems thrive on this because, oh, I can go and attack, oh, that black woman down the street, I can go attack that gay person over there, I can just go and attack that woman because she's different to me, we don't share the same gender, or we don't share the same ethnicity, or she looks different, or also speaks this other language, so I can attack her to feel as though I'm making some sense of change. The shared suffering we have, and if we don't understand that our suffering is shared, it leads to this frustration in which we attack other people who are also suffering the same way we're suffering, and we become unintentionally or intentionally exploiters and oppressors of other people. And I really want to quote something said by Sata Shakur, rest in peace to her. She says, we need to become weapons of mass constructions, weapons of mass love. It's not enough to just change the system, we must change ourselves. And I completely agree. We must change the way in which we think of other people, and which is why I really emphasize a lot on the de-individualization of suffering. Just you suffered the same way your neighbor has suffered. That shared suffering should be a bridge in which you advocate against the system. A lot of people think we are a minority. Your suffering is majority. The majority amount of people in society are going through issues like poverty, can't afford to put meals on their table. They're going through levels of housing crisis, or just housing issues, for instance, like mold. Mold is a really big issue that a lot of people face. Mold doesn't discriminate based on race, for instance, but it discriminates based on class. Rich people can afford to not have mold in their houses. Rich landlords don't have mold in their houses, but they tell you to open your windows and you have mold in your house and you're getting sick. And mold can make you quite sick. As someone who's lived with mold, it can make you quite sick, like really, really bad respiratory issues. So when you start to think consciously, you must really awaken a consciousness in which ask yourself, these differences, they don't really do that much for me in making my suffering less. You're blaming your next door neighbor, for instance, because they don't look like you or they act differently. But has that solved the root of your suffering? And it's that kind of consciousness that allows movements to go forward, essentially. And that kind of suffering that really allows us to be more conscious. But I think we are losing this consciousness for a generation in which we identify more with the differences in identity, like, oh, I'm a black person, I'm a woman, I'm gay, I'm like this, I'm like that. You cannot see allies around you who share the same issue as you despite your identity. And identity, the fact that the way you suffer isn't based either out or like you're all suffering the same way, essentially. And I think the way in which to awaken this consciousness is through reading and expanding your worldview and engaging with literature, whether that be fiction or non-fiction. And I want to link this into a quote said by James Baldwin, in which he says, you read something which you thought only happened to you, discover it happened 100 years ago to Dostoevsky. And I feel like that fully encapsulates the world of reading, whether it be fiction or non-fiction. You think something so unique to you happened just to you. Then you realize it happened to great writers, great Russian writers like Dostoevsky, and it can continuously happen unless we we try and change the system, which is why I see sometimes your suffering is collective also. The way in which you suffered has been suffered by people before you. And what have they done? And what can we learn? And what can we take away from this? And I think in reading, this look down upon people who read fiction. And I completely disagree with that. I think fiction is one of the first ways in which a lot of us learn how to read, but also one of the ways we learn the key skill of empathy. We empathize with characters we read them because we're often reading these books in first person or third person, either way. We put ourselves in their shoes. We imagine a world in which our characters have lived. Like, let me use the great example of The Hunger Games, for instance, in which Katniss Everdeen is in this dystopian world in which she's forced to fight for her life. And many of us will not have experienced that. Some people will have experienced that in their life. Many of us will not have. But in which putting ourselves in her shoes and understanding the level of suffering she goes through and a level of exploitation and again suffering she goes through, we learn so much about what to look out in our world, and we can make literal parallels between the world of the Hunger Games and the world we live in right now. I will literally input the clip into this, but the Hunger Games creator, I can't remember her name, literally said she was inspired by watching media coverage on the Iraqi war, and that's what inspired her to watch Hunger Games. I can even say that the Iraqi war, if I think about the Iraqi war, I see so many parallels between the Iraqi war and the Vietnam War, in which it was the first war televised, and now we have most of the war televised because of the way we use media now and the way media controls us. But understanding that's from a fictional book, real world events have inspired a fictional book. So when people look down on fiction, I say learning is learning. You're reading, you're engaging, you're expanding your worldview. Either way, you're thinking critically, and we need that level of consciousness to have a revolution or to have a way in which systems change, essentially. And as Toni Morrison says, the function of freedom is to free somebody else. Freedom itself is a privilege. The way in which I'm able to speak and discuss about this, freedom of press, which we're slowly losing in the West, also is a privilege. And if I have this freedom in which I can discuss these critical ideas, it is my right, it is my pursuit in which I share that freedom. That why must I only be the only tall person if other people around me are shorter and suffering, essentially? I find it so strange when people look down on emotions like empathy as a soft emotion. Empathy is soft, and it should be, but it's also one of the strongest emotions we have as human beings. In empathy, we're able to create revolutions. Revolutions start out of empathy, that I feel bad or I have allegiance to what my neighbor is feeling and this shared suffering that we both understand, that we're both going through this thing. Or maybe I am not going through this thing, but it affects the way I see the world on a level. And in the danger of losing humanity, as Toni Morrison says, we must fight the danger of losing humanity with more humanity. We must be more empathetic to deal with the more suffering we have, in which the systems work around us because they think you don't care. They work on the fact that you don't care and you feel comfortable enough to see issues like genocide and war on TV, and you can scroll past and watch an advert or dissociate because media isn't supposed to reflect reality. Media can do both. Media can both reflect reality and also give us reality in which we have not imagined. It gives a play, and I think humor does a great effects of this. Like, if I think of things that have truly made me laugh, like Boondocks or like just great comedians, humor works with a bit of truth and reality, and a good amount of humor that's disguised as a good amount of comedy that's despised as humor, but is like a tick or a criticism of the government or systems we live in, and we laugh about it. But it's like, wait, no, that's true. The way in which the system oppresses us, oh, hee hee ha ha, funny. But I go home and I'm still oppressed beneath the system. It leaves you thinking. Good media should make you think, should make you uncomfortable, essentially. I hope I'm also doing that, making you think consciously and awakening the consciousness in which you think suffering is not okay and in which you should be loud about your suffering also. I also find importance in being loud about your suffering is when you're loud and vocal about your suffering, that you kind of act as a beacon of light, in which James Baldwin says that you shed light into other people's suffering and they see perhaps solution, or they see acknowledgement of their own suffering, in which people can turn the TV, you're loud about your suffering, they're like, oh, you're going through that too. I'm also going through that. And in that way you become conscious in which suffering is not isolated. The system thrives because you think you're alone in suffering and you feel like, if I speak about this, no one even cares. a lot of people care. They're also terrified, in which you cannot see someone who's going through the same issues as you, so you don't speak. Be that person in which you speak, in which you have people thinking, and make people uncomfortable in thought and be like, I live in the system. The suffering that I see on TV, I see on media, we are so comfortable with the brown faces suffering, with POC suffering. And I really want to acknowledge this a lot when I really notice this a lot more, especially with the war that's happening in Ukraine versus Russia at the moment, in which the war is not okay. I will never condone that level of violence against innocent people. But I do want to acknowledge the media coverage around it, in which one media presenter said that, oh, this is the West. This is not somewhere in the Middle East, in which they were uncomfortable with white bodies, but they're so comfortable with black and brown bodies or indigenous bodies, and we're so comfortable with seeing that in the media.
Stories of border guards and others turning away black and brown people who are also trying to escape the war in Ukraine, because representation, of course, really influences whose lives some people view as worth saving.
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
On parle pas là de Syriens qui fuient.
I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
I think what's also horrific is the racialized hierarchy of life that we're seeing in some of the reporting of the war.
And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that...
With all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
We need to question, why am I so comfortable with suffering of people who look like me, who are black, who are brown, as compared to suffering of white individuals on white bodies on my screen? Suffering, suffering, it seems, or empathy or suffering in media is dependent on the color of the body or the gender of the body, for instance, in which we are comfortable with women of color going missing, indigenous women going missing, and a level of suffering experienced by those communities, but not with white suffering, where I argue we should be uncomfortable with all types of suffering, and in which we deconstruct our consciousness or bias around that. And I used to have a bias around that as well. Like, I would put on the TV, I would see news, and obviously the news is just mostly bad things in the world anyway, but I got so comfortable or complacent or used to seeing war and genocide on my screen. I was like, I'll scroll past. It's really important to be conscious in which the way the media you're passively consuming is giving you information, you just choose not to engage, but also thinking the suffering is man-made. I pay taxes to the system that causes the suffering elsewhere. Am I complicit in the way in which suffering is enacted and oppressed in other places abroad because it's not happening where I live directly? And I think at times I also want to acknowledge the fact of geographic privilege, in which I do have geographic privilege. And I know this because I've lived in Nigeria and I live in the UK. And I can say that, oh, I do have geographic privilege in which some of the things I went through in Nigeria, I could never have gone through in the UK if I just lived here. And I guess vice versa. I would say some of the privileges I've experienced here, I don't think I would experience in Nigeria, for instance. And in understanding that, it's just really, really important to be loud about suffering. And I really want to mention a quote said by Zora Neale Hurston, in which she says, if you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. Especially in the world we live in, where media is so wish-washy, in which what you said or didn't say or what you could have said becomes misconstrued. It's important to be loud about your suffering and your advocacy. Important to be loud and be like, I am here, I am conscious, I will be heard. And when I bleed loudly. And I was speaking about this in relation of the kind of suffering that women go through, for instance, and the medical negligence that a lot of women go through. And you think you're so isolated, and then it's only up to recently, for instance, with TikTok, for instance, and other types of social media where people feel comfortable enough talking about suffering in the instance of, oh, I go through painful periods, and then medical experts are like, you shouldn't be going through painful periods, but we've been made to think our suffering is normal as women. And then as women of color, in which you talk about your fears around, like dying in childbirth, for instance, and women Black women are 6 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. And why is that? And we question it when we share our suffering and be like, it's not just me that's going through this, it's an issue in the community. And it's an issue that needs to be discussed. And it prompts change. It prompts changes in research. It prompts interest into what is going on in this area, that people are suffering like this and we're comfortable with their suffering. We must be loud, we must be bold, we must be unafraid. And when we have privilege to speak, like, because you speaking on TikTok or speaking on YouTube or having internet is a privilege in itself, which is why I think I can be so bold in the way I advocate for things, for instance. And even when I am away from the issue, I feel as though it is my right to encourage people to read more about the issue or encourage people to engage more about issues of great importance. You know what I mean? Like, just because you have now been liberated is your responsibility in a sense, because freedom, like I said, is a privilege to liberate other people, to share this information with other people that don't know about it, to make people understand, to make people hear suffering. If you're so uncomfortable with me suffering and hearing about it, change it so I don't have to speak about it anymore. Change the way in which I don't have to suffer anymore. And for us to change that, we must change the way in which systems we live in deal with suffering, especially suffering of coloured bodies, of black bodies, of indigenous bodies, of women's bodies, women's of colours bodies. And that itself will probably be a whole separate conversation in terms of revolution and how we think about that. But I did really want to talk about this idea of collective suffering and why it's so important to be so loud. And finally, I want to end with this, that we are all lights, beacons, agents of change, in which James Baldwin says, like, we can shed light and that light can help someone overcome an adversity they feel. Sorry, my voice is kind of going. That light can help someone overcome an adversity that they feel. And us being beacons and agents of change is so important, especially when we use apps like social media apps that are what made of the system or allowed to exist in the system, like TikTok or Instagram. And people often look down on social media, and obviously you have questions around it because misinformation and disinformation and blah 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 are true. But in that same instance, social media is one of the first little instances where we have free press, if we think about it, where you don't have to, like, oh, do this, do that, do that. You can just speak your mind and show your opinion on something, and people can, like, critically engage with that, whether they agree or disagree with you. Like in this instance as well, people can disagree or agree with me in the way I discuss suffering, and it gives me a lot to think about or a lot to construct. And like the way I share my opinions as well, people can also quickly think, and hopefully that can awaken some consciousness in any of us in that instance. That's all I try and do. So when people look down on like social media as well and think, oh, it doesn't really do much, then why is what the US government trying to obtain it? They're trying to control the way in which we understand free media and free information, for instance. And I think it's just really, really important to be loud about the things you care about. And in the instance of which I talk about suffering as a collectiveness, as a collective movement, it's important for us to be loud about those issues and not to have shame, because the system thrives on you being ashamed of yourself, and this shame or this guilt of being, I just feel so worthless and I feel so dirty and I feel as though I'm not the right person. Who is the right person to speak? You look at the right person, you are the right person, because no matter what you look like, you are a beacon, agent of change. You are a reflection of the world, and the world needs to hear that. In the instance of someone who looks like me speaking about issues like this, I feel empowered. You never having people who look like you to speak about issues that are happening to you is dangerous, and you should, and you feel like that, and you feel isolated and suffering because no one looks like you who's speaking about that issue, then speak up about it. Be that agent of change and be empowered. But I do think to be loud about suffering, you do need to go through a level of grace in which you forgive yourself, in which you understand your suffering, which is why I really want to explore understanding suffering initially, in which you understand the suffering you're going through and be like, and be able to understand that the suffering you're going through isn't this quote unquote inevitable thing always. If it's man-made, if it can be stopped, if something can be done to alleviate suffering, then it should be done, and you can advocate and be loud for that. And understanding that, you kind of give yourself grace in which you become a beacon of light and hope to other people, essentially. But that was a lot, sorry. That was a lot, but I just really wanted to share that because it was just some of the things I was reflecting on this week, especially because I just turned 21. I'm only 21, and I've been traveling for my birthday, so my friends took me to Venice for a day trip, and something I just reflected on whilst in Venice as well, in which the way I've suffered isn't unique to me suffering in the UK, but people also suffer like that in Italy and elsewhere. And I just thought, isn't it crazy? No matter where you go, there's a level of suffering and impoverishment and like oppression wherever you are, essentially, even in your holiday destinations or your locations. And if you have enough privilege in which you can speak about it, then you can create changes or ripple effects in society, essentially. But if you liked this video, thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe. A lot of you have already done that. Hi to all the new people. It's crazy that so many people want to hear me like speak and talk, so that's cool. Hi. Yeah, I might do like a Venice vlog or something like that. But yeah, look out for my other videos. I'm really trying to post weekly unless I have exams, but toodles.